Cap sur la transition, heading for the transition. We look at the environmental public policies here. This is the IDDRI podcast. The leaders of 7 of the world's most industrialized nations met in Évian in mid-June. It was the G7 under the French presidency, and it went off without a hitch. This time, US President Donald Trump stayed until the very end. But what can be drawn from this in light of the challenges regarding climate, sustainable development, and equity in a world upended by major wars, imposing an agenda centered on military and economic security, and where the president of the leading power refuses to hear the words climate or gender, were the topics related to the transition able to find a place in the discussions? Moreover, does the G7 still wield the same influence as before? How does it engage with the rest of the world? And what other international forums might step in to advance the many issues surrounding the transition as the world grapples with resurgence of pandemics and natural disasters? Céline Kauffmann is with us today to break down the outcomes of this summit. Céline is the Chief Program Officer at IDDRI. Let's get started. Hello, Céline.
Hello.
Let's focus first on the G7 summit in Évian. And you were in a very good position to observe what happened there, since IDDRI coordinated the T7, which is the official engagement group for global think tanks to provide recommendations for the G7. So the leaders who gathered for 3 days concluded with 9 consensus documents. Briefly, before developing specific topics, would you say that the French presidency can be proud of the G7 results?
Yes, we can say that the French presidency's ambition has largely been achieved. With the G7, first, the uncertainty surrounding the US president's behavior has been contained. Second, the key priorities that were put on the table by the French, meaning the macroeconomic imbalances and the renewal of development partnerships, have provided a framework that was sufficiently broad, ambitious, and interdependent to guide the discussions. Third, those discussions led very concretely to opportunities for coordination among G7 countries on conflict management, on economic security, on critical minerals, on digital technology, on health, and even on development finance. In total, you mentioned it, the G7 has delivered 9 leader statements, but also some 15 to 17 ministerial outcome documents, and they were all adopted by consensus between April and June 2026. And finally, a number of bridges were established with non-G7 economies. And it was a very strong objective of the French presidency, which played a very proactive role to involve partner countries in the work, as well as in the final declarations, with some success. So you can see that the calls on cancer and on digital safety for minors received very broad support from Brazil, Egypt, India, Kenya, South Korea. But at the same time, others, like the Declaration on Critical Minerals, was only endorsed by Australia. And throughout the process, China has chosen to remain on the sideline of a club whose intentions it deemed hostile. However, the quest for consensus also meant that the G7 stayed away from openly mentioning climate, sustainable development, and equity, wording that is forbidden by the US.
If the very words themselves are banished from public discourses, so as not to anger Donald Trump, does that mean that the G7 this year did not address these issues?
Not really, because first, reality is sticky. Banning certain words does not make the issues go away. And for example, the Iran war and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz reminded us that we were very dependent on fossil fuels, and this made us vulnerable. It was brought back on the table of the G7, and it's been for the countries around the table a wake-up call to transition away from fossil fuels. Second, the increasing frequency of natural disasters and extreme weather events is rendering some territories, including in rich G7 countries, partially or totally uninsurable. They have become an important topic for discussion for finance ministers and for leaders due to the risk that they pose to public budgets and economic stability. And then one of the core discussions of the G7 throughout the tracks has been about critical raw material. And that is as much about defense as it is about digital transition and green transition. So the climate agenda is never far from the discussions, even at the G7, where openly the words are not allowed. However, what we've seen is that if some areas can be pushed without using the direct terminology, others have completely disappeared from the G7 agenda, even though they had previously been under discussion and where G7 leaders were pushing very strongly. So this is, for example, the case of climate finance. It's the case of the phasing out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. And it's also the case of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So we can see that economic security cannot encompass all the sustainable development issues.
Céline, you've just mentioned the critical raw minerals as a different route to address climate change. It was the subject of one of the final G7 leaders' declarations. Can you explain what progress has been made in these discussions?
Yes, you're right. It was the focus of one of the leaders' declaration. It was also actually a recurring theme throughout the ministerial meetings and the different G7 tracks. So, for example, the G7 trade ministers' communique focuses on resilient and secure critical raw material supply chains. The finance ministers and central bank governance communique had a whole section on economic security that was mostly about securing diversification of CRM, and the labor and employment ministers' communique led to the endorsement of the G7 toolkit for standard-based criteria to identify risk of forced labor in the extraction of critical minerals. So it's run
when you say CRM, it's critical raw minerals.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. But you mentioned the leaders' declaration, and that leaders' declaration dedicated to securing supply chains for critical minerals led to the adoption by G7 countries of what was called a supply chain resilience target, which aimed to reduce dependence on any single supplier of rare earth and permanent magnets to below 60% by 2030. Countries also agreed to adopt such a target for all other critical raw materials without actually naming a specific list. They also agreed to develop similar targets for other critical raw materials and to develop targets of recycled material in selected critical mineral supply chains as well.
When you mention a target reducing dependence on any single supplier, that means China.
Exactly. The ambition is very clear. It is diversifying away from China. But the timeline makes it very challenging because if you look at where we stand today, and according to the International Energy Agency, counting all existing and announced projects, the capacity in 2035, which is not the 2030 target that the G7 countries are talking about, would only cover 50% of extraction needs, only 25% of refining needs, and even less of 20% of magnet manufacturing needs. So we are very far away from the 60% independence target. It means a very big push in terms of investment in the supply chains and in the right parts of the supply chain as well.
Is it realistic?
It is significant in at least two respects. The first one is that it sends a very strong signal to China that the monopoly on production and refinement is not acceptable anymore to the G7 countries. And second, the agreement outlines a path for cooperation with other third parties, third countries, involved in the value chains and in particular the producing countries, through local value creation and the mobilization of funding from development banks. If you will, it serves as an illustration of the renewal of development partnerships that has been discussed very strongly in the development path of the G7.
And how does the G7 intend to implement this cooperation?
In the declaration, the G7 proposes to establish a diversification club in the form of an open platform overseen by the G7 and supported by data and analysis coming from the OECD and the IEA. But the success of that club, diversification club, very much depend on the willingness of the potential participating countries to stand up to China, because it's an open statement that they want to diversify away from China. And it will depend as well on its ability to address the expectations of those producing countries. And in the T7, this is typically an area where we had proposed to establish pilot projects, and we make a number of recommendations in that direction.
Céline, some consider the G7 to be a weakened forum, especially on topics like climate change, climate finance, etc. You mentioned that. Where else, in what other areas can progress on these issues be expected?
Well, there are several organizations and instruments and agreements, in particular within the framework of the United Nations, that underpin cooperation in sustainable developments. It is the case of the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change for Climate and the Paris Agreement. It is the case of the Sustainable Development Goals for Sustainable Development that were both adopted back in 2015, by the way. They were established to provide the long-term anchor, to provide perspective for systemic transformations, carbon neutrality towards mid-century for the Paris Agreement, or progress towards targets by 2030 for the SDGs. Today, those fora face a number of challenges related to the implementation of those frameworks. In addition to those important conventions and frameworks, today the discussion on sustainable development is very much related to development finance, to implement those objectives. And this is giving a very strong role to the development banks. If you go back to the G7 presidency had a very strong focus on what is called mutually beneficial partnership in a context of very deep cuts in development assistance, in the concessional money that the G7 countries were giving to developing countries. But the new narrative that is put forward raises a number of questions of whether there is enough of this concessional money to cover all the priority needs, and whether there is a capacity to raise the additional funding through private sector. And this is where the multilateral development banks can play a very important role.
Are those multilateral development banks answering this question of finance?
Well, what we've seen this year is a number of developments that point to that direction. The first is on the back of the spring meetings in April in Washington, we saw a number of multilateral development banks putting on the table a joint declaration on financing critical raw materials. So that's one element. Then more recently, what we've seen is the World Bank renewing its climate plan, which was not given the geopolitics within the board of the bank. What will be very significant and important to watch out for is what's going to happen to the Multilateral Development Bank roadmap within the G20 after this year. That has been a white year because of the US presidency, but given that the G20 is actually going to the UK next year. And this roadmap was an important piece in the puzzle of unblocking some of the finance discussion on sustainable development, both because the banks have the capacity to actually help manage and coordinate the reduced, pot of concessional funding and make more coherent the action of donors, but also because they have a very strong role in terms of catalyzing private sector money.
The G20 you've just mentioned, this is the other major economic cooperation club whose member countries account for more than 2/3 of global trade and population, a club including China, India, or the African Union. Can we expect progress in this forum, maybe more than in the G7?
So the G20 is definitely the right forum to be discussing these issues of sustainable development because of its constituency going beyond the richer countries, let's say, and also because of the rebalancing of power in the world. It's a bit early to say what the UK will be doing with its G20 when it gets it from the US towards the end of the year, partly because of the change in prime minister that is too recent in the UK to tell exactly what will be the direction that the new PM will choose. But in any case, what we know is that the UK will have an important role to rebuild the structure of the G20, because the US has streamlined very deeply the G20 and collapsing some of the working groups and the tracks. We know in any case that the UK will be very interested in issues related to resilience and insurance and private sector mobilization, because the role of the UK as a finance hub in the world. It will also be very important to see how the dynamics with China will evolve after the G7 that is read as being antagonistic to the country. China has recently put forward its global governance initiative that shows that it is very attached to multilateralism and wants to invest more in both BRICS and the G20. We also know that China is very attached to climate, the climate framework, because of its extrovert growth model relying on green techs. Mm-hmm. But how it will relate to the G20 is still a question mark given this year's G7. I think the upcoming BRICS summit under the Indian presidency that will take place in Delhi early September will be very telling in terms of that dynamics, not only from China, but together with other big emerging economies. And so it's a very important summit to watch out for. And to close on G7, after France, the presidency will go to the US. And of course, it is a big unknown in terms of what the US will choose to do with the G7, given their, attitude vis-à-vis G20 and previous statement by the US president that he was not very keen on the G7.
Thank you, Céline, for your analysis and explanations. Your latest blog post can be found on the IDDRI's website, along with numerous other publications. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
This is the end for today and of this episode. I hope that it will have provided useful insights into the strengths and weakness of this G7 forum. You can find and listen to all the IDDRI podcasts on its website. Till the next episode, look after yourself and our planet.